Hello again, class. Today we're going to start a new unit. This unit is going to focus on the economy and new technology in the early part of the 19th century. All right, that's why I call it the three I's: enterprise, inventions, and industry. As you see, I sort of had to spell enterprise in a creative way to make it an I. All right, but we're going to focus on enterprise, which is, businesses, things like that, inventions, and then industry. All right, so those are just types of jobs that are available. This first lesson is going to basically explain what free enterprise is. And we're going to talk about the American system and then talk about free enterprise. But before we do that, let's review. Mercantilism. We haven't talked about this economic theory in quite a while, but remember, back during the colonial period, when Britain still ruled America, Britain and the rest of the European colonial powers functioned under the economic system of mercantilism. And remember, this is an economic theory that says a mother country, like Britain, should control the economy and the trade of its colonies, right? So like 13 colonies in America. And the underlying assumption of mercantilism is that colonies exist solely to make the mother country rich. Okay? So because the mother country, again, like Britain, is supposed to get rich off of its colonies, then that mother country should control their economy in ways that helps the mother country, not the 13 colonies, or not the colony like America. Right? And so that's why Britain had no problem passing laws like the Tea Act, telling America where it could and couldn't buy tea, because Britain wasn't worried about how to best serve the tea drinkers of America. It was more worried about how does Britain make money for Britain and British companies. Remember, that was mercantilism. But after independence, after the independence and the Treaty of Paris, America wasn't controlled by Great Britain and mercantilism anymore. And therefore, America needed a new type of economic system. Before we go too much further, let's make sure we understand what economics is. Economics is a study of how a country uses its resources. One way to say it is who gets rich and how and why. Because every country has a certain amount of resources. Now, the resources can be anywhere from, refers to everything, including, the people, the workers, the natural resources, whether it's wood, lumber, today, countries' resources may include oil and gas. It's always included things like gold. For a while, coal was important. Those are the type of resources. How much land a country has. How good is the land for either mining or farming or some other use. Now, that's what economics studies. How does a country use whatever resources it has, land, labor, natural resources, etc., and how does it allocate those, among its citizens, among its people? That's what economics studies. You know who we haven't talked about in a while? And quite frankly, I don't know how long it's been since we've talked about these two, because I talk about them a lot. But who had the first arguments about what kind of economy America should have? All right, so if you remember our early discussions on the early republic and Washington's cabinet, or if you just remember some of the scenes from the musical Hamilton, you'll know I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. So remember, Jefferson wanted an agriculture-based economy, right? Farming. Hamilton wanted a manufacturing-based economy, right? Economy built on making things. And let's review what developed as a result of these Jefferson and Hamilton arguments. That's right, the first political parties. Right? Hamilton's Federalist Party, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. So remember, way back in the 1790s, under George Washington's cabinet, there was a battle over the type of economy America was going to have, and ultimately political parties formed up around the different arguments. So let's try to remember, who won these arguments? Well, you may be tempted to say, well Jefferson did, because the Democratic Republicans ended up becoming the only party left. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, even John Quincy Adams were all members of the Democratic Republican Party, and the Federalists basically disappeared. And that's true. Jefferson's party had long-term success in the Federalist Party. But in terms of what type of economy America was to have, Hamilton's arguments ended up winning, albeit with a lot of help from Henry Clay. And yes, that Henry Clay, he of the corrupt bargain, the guy who we talked to, ran for president back in 1824, again in 1832. He actually ran for president until 3 times, I believe. That Henry Clay, when he was in Congress, he proposed what is called the American system. So I put this in bold, so you should definitely make note of it. And the American system had 3 parts to it. First, protective tariffs. Second, a national bank. Now this should sound pretty familiar, because once upon a time we had a lecture where we talked about Hamilton's 3-part economic plan, and they too involved these two ideas, protective tariffs and national banks. The third part of Clay's American system are internal improvements, infrastructure. Okay? Again, that's like building roads, bridges. Back then, canals would have been an important thing to build. So Clay proposed the American system. The way America is going to have a great economy is through protective tariffs, which, as we've talked a lot about, leads to more manufacturing. The national bank to sort of control the American money supply. And finally, internal improvements. Help the transportation by building better roads, building canals. That way, people and companies can ship their goods across this, what was becoming a very large nation at that time. And that would help business. Now, let's review. Who opposed these things, especially the first 2? Remember, Andrew Jackson did. Or at least, he wasn't a fan of tariffs. Now remember, he wasn't about to give in to South Carolina's threat of nullification, but he wasn't a fan of tariffs, and he wasn't a fan of the national bank. Jackson opposed these 2 things in the American system. And what developed as a result? Once again, you had political parties. This time it was Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party and Henry Clay's Whig Party. Remember that we learned about the Whigs a few weeks ago. All right. Now, before we go to the next slide, I also just want to throw up, we've also talked about, what protective tariffs and internal improvements led to, and that was sectionalism. Remember our lesson on sectionalism, how different sections of the country, care more about their particular region than the country as a whole. And remember, there was a big debate between the North and the South over protective tariffs. And then with internal improvements, the West and the North were in favor, but the South was against them. So remember, the first and third item on this list, it really led to the sectionalism that we've discussed before, and we'll keep discussing throughout this course. The first 1 and 2 points, as I've already said, really developed into the second group of political parties. Yeah, so that was the American system. And ultimately, again, just like Hamilton, Henry Clay's ideas on the economy, although his party doesn't necessarily have more success than Andrew Jackson's party, just like Hamilton's party didn't have more success than Jefferson's party, ultimately their ideas on what the economy should be, i.e. more manufacturing based, does win out. So the economic system that America eventually adopted and still uses today is called free enterprise. And now you may have heard of this term capitalism, and for purposes of this class, you can treat free enterprise as a synonym for capitalism. Now there may come a day in high school or college where the professor tries to give you a slight distinction between those two terms, but we're not going to talk about it in that much detail. We can just talk about free enterprise and capitalism as being synonyms. Capitalism is the term we use more currently. I'll probably use I definitely will use the term free enterprise more in this lecture, though. So in a free enterprise system, businesses, at least theoretically, run freely without control from the government. Right? That's where that word free comes in, that enterprise. Right? And by the way, the word enterprise, it's just sort of like a business venture. Right? That's kind of what an enterprise. If you take on an enterprise, you're taking on an activity or trying to achieve some sort of goal or something. That's an enterprise. It really refers to a business here. So in a free enterprise, businesses are, at least theoretically, supposed to run freely without control from the government. And, let me go back and just talk about this word theoretically. Because, yes, theoretically, they're supposed to run free without control from the government. But, that doesn't always happen. The government always has a little bit of control. For example, a factory can't take its toxic waste and dump it into the town river. There are rules about those sort of things. So, as we'll talk more throughout this lesson, there are controls. But in theory, businesses are supposed to run free of government control. Right. There are 5 aspects to a free enterprise system. 1, private enterprise. This just means individuals and businesses, not the government, decide what kind of businesses to have and how to run those businesses. The government doesn't get to say, it's like, okay, we're going to have 2 phone companies and 1 television company and 2 clothing companies, and that's all. And here's the things you'll make, and here's how you'll run the company. In a free enterprise system, the government doesn't get to do that. Individuals and the companies they create get to make these decisions. And sometimes they make good decisions, and sometimes they make bad decisions. But they're the people's and the company's decisions to make, not the government. All right, the second aspect is competition. All right. The theory in our free enterprise system is that companies will compete with each other. All right, if you have a company that makes and sells staplers, all right, you're going to try to do better than the other company in town that makes and sells staplers, okay? Because you want customers. And if you have a stapler that doesn't work, that costs $50, well, no one in town is going to buy your stapler. They're going to go to the other store that makes and sells staplers. All right. And so this idea that competition will force businesses to improve their products and services and to keep prices low. Because you have to make sure people buy your product and not your competitor's product. All right, the third aspect is private property. Again, individuals and businesses own the property. Okay. Now, if you think about the big companies we have now. Amazon is owned. The big owner in that one is Jeff Bezos. All right. Tesla, you have Elon Musk. All right. Twitter is owned by a guy named, or at least run by a guy named Jack Dorsey. All right. Individuals own businesses, and it doesn't have to be these huge businesses. And quite frankly, the bigger a business gets, probably the more owners it's going to have. But from the gas station, down the street from the school, that's owned by a single family. So you can have small businesses and large businesses, but in a free enterprise system, those businesses are owned by individuals. Maybe one individual, maybe 1,000 individuals, but they're owned by individuals, not the government. Fourth aspect is profit motive. This means businesses exist to make money. That is their goal, to make money. If a business goes long enough period of time without making money, it's going to go out of business. It's not going to be able to survive. A business has to make money to live and survive. Okay? Now, it'd be great if businesses all were trying to be socially responsible and help the city they're in and help the country and help society and all that. And sometimes maybe they do. But their first and foremost goal is always to make money, because if they're not making money, they're going to go out of business, and they're not going to be able to help anybody, including the employees. Fifth and last aspect is consumer sovereignty. All right? Consumer is the person who buys things. All right? We're all consumers. We go and buy food from neighborhood restaurants, or a candy bar from the convenience store by the school. We buy shoes and hats and all sorts of things. We're all consumers. And in a free enterprise system, the consumer gets to decide what they buy and how much they're willing to pay. Already in my example earlier, I talked about selling a stapler, for $50 that doesn't work very well. Well, not many consumers are going to buy that stapler. All right, most consumers are going to decide, I don't want that stapler. And the government doesn't get to control that. The government doesn't say, hey, everybody needs to go out and buy a $50 stapler now. No, our consumers get to decide. I'm sure there are many, many people who don't own a stapler at all. Right? Some people, if you're a teacher, you have to own a stapler. But ultimately, the consumer gets to decide what they do and do not buy. All right, so those are the 5 aspects of a free enterprise system. Private enterprise, competition, private property, profit motive, and consumer sovereignty. All right, so what is the government's role in a, quote, free enterprise system? In theory, as little as possible. Now, true believers in an extreme form of free enterprise system, that's called laissez-faire. That's a French term. It basically just means the government's completely hands-off. Now, true believers in this extreme form of free enterprise don't believe the government should interfere with the economy at all. None. So if you have a depression, an economic depression like the Great Depression, and 25% of the people lose their jobs, people who believe in this extreme form of free enterprise system, this laissez-faire economy, just simply think, oh well, too bad for those people. Maybe they'll get a job when the economy improves. Because their idea is if you didn't have any government influence in the economy, then the economy would always end up eventually being better, and that economic depressions or recessions are just simply pointing out flaws that need to be fixed within the economy itself. All right. Now, in reality, there may be a few people in our country who say they believe in that form of economy, but there probably aren't too many people, here in 2021, who would actually advocate that America could go completely to a laissez-faire economy. Right? Because in reality, the government protects private property and ensures that businesses operate fairly. All right, so this is what I was saying earlier. Some factory in town can't go dump its toxic waste and all of its pollution into the local river, because then that would hurt everybody else who's getting their water from the river, or who swims in the river or fishes in the river. That's hurting everyone else in town, and that wouldn't be fair. And so the government's there to protect other people's property and to ensure that businesses are operating fairly. All right, government's there to keep there are rules businesses have. Let me start this sentence over. Most states have laws that forbid certain types of fraud, or basically lying. So they won't let a business lie to a consumer to sell them, something that's not what it was promised to be. There are laws against that sort of thing. Okay. So the government does protect, private property and ensure that businesses operate fairly. And so I'll ask you, has America ever really had a laissez-faire economy, one where the government simply didn't have any interference? And I would argue, no, probably not. Because remember, even going back to when Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's Secretary of Treasury, we had tariffs that were designed to help the manufacturing industry. Right? They were specifically designed to boost up one part of the economy, even though, the South was down there saying, hey, this is hurting us. So, going back to the 1790s, I don't think we've ever really had a time where the government was 100% completely out of, at least some form of regulating or trying to affect the economy in some form or fashion. Okay, so I don't think America's ever truly had a laissez-faire economy. They were probably pretty close at times during the, maybe late 1800s, but it's never truly been laissez-faire. There's always been some government intervention. And after the Great Depression, there just was going to come more and more government intervention. All right. Now, in a free enterprise system, businesses are free to sell their goods in what is called the market. Okay? That term market, it can be both very literal, but it can also be metaphorical. Okay? Think about a market like a supermarket or a farmer's market. Goods are sold there. And when we're talking about the free enterprise system, we kind of have this metaphorical and visionary market where everything available for sale in a city or state or country is all kind of in one giant market. All right? And people can choose what they buy and sell there. Okay? And so therefore, a free enterprise system is also called a market economy. Okay? So again, it's somewhat of a metaphor because it invokes this image of someone going to a flea market or farmer's market, which do exist still today. Okay? But when we talk about the country as a whole, obviously not everything being sold in the country can be sold at one single market. Right? You couldn't fit every pair of shoes or every hat that's being sold in America in one place, nor could you have 350 million people all shopping in one same place. But so we use this metaphor to pretend that it's all in the same market. And so a free enterprise system is called the market economy. Right? Because in a free enterprise or market economy, decisions are based on the market, not by the government. All right? This is where you get into some issues of supply and demand. Okay? For instance, think about, recently when we had the big snow and ice storm, okay? And everybody lost power. Now, if you had a store that sold blankets, for instance, and you only had 10 blankets, you could have basically charged whatever you wanted and people would have paid it. You could have charged $500 for those blankets. Now, to be fair, in a natural disaster that there are sort of rules against this sort of thing, but let's pretend those rules don't exist. All right? In a true market economy, you could have sold those blankets for as much as you wanted. If you wanted to sell those blankets for $500 a blanket, and because you only had 10 of them, you would have found 10 people to buy those blankets. Okay, that's what it means by the market decides what gets sold and at what price. Now let's flip that script. Let's change the scenario. Let's say you have a store and you have 1,000 blankets, and you're trying to sell them in the middle of summer. Who wants to buy a blanket in the middle of summer? Okay, so now you have 1,000 blankets, and you don't have room for them. So now you're going to sell those blankets for a very cheap price. All right, you may sell those blankets for $5 a blanket in order to sell them because you have way more blankets, 1,000 blankets, than there are people who want to buy a blanket in the middle of summer. Okay, that's how the market economy sort of, in theory, works. That the quote-unquote market, the people within the market decide what something is worth. If you have something that a lot of people want, then the value of that goes up. If you have something that not a lot of people want, then the value of it goes down. All right? And again, those decisions in a free enterprise system are made by the quote-unquote market, or the people who make up the market, not by the government. You could have an economic system where the government says all blankets in the country are sold for $25 a blanket. We don't care if one person wants it or 1,000 people want that blanket, it's sold for $25. Okay? You could have, but that's not what you have in a market economy. The people within the market make these decisions. Okay. And this is the economy that developed in the 1800s in America. So the switch from mercantilism and a farm-based economy, all right, to a market economy, we call that the market revolution. Okay. The market revolution. Now, as you recall, when we did our lesson on women's rights, and we looked at that photograph or that drawing, that illustration of the women, going down the Seneca Falls waterfall, on the waterfall and following, quote, the market economy towards more equality. Remember, that's what the market revolution is talking about on that painting or that picture, if you remember it. We talked about it last time. All right, and that was the market revolution. So it's taking place at the same time as these other developments, as the women's rights movement, as the temperance movement, as the Second Great Awakening. This market revolution is also taking place, where the economy is switching. And it's certainly not mercantilism anymore, and it's going more and more away from a farm-based economy to more of a market economy. You're charging prices based on what people are willing to buy. As opposed to a farm-based economy, you may say, hey, I have 3 extra bushels of corn. I'll give you a bushel of corn if you give me 2 chickens, or something like that. The market revolution changes that. And so the market revolution starts to create the economy we have today, where people buy and sell things based on money, and that's kind of what drives prices. Right? And how much money people have or want to spend on something determines the price and how often things sell. Okay, so that's our discussion on the free enterprise. I know it's a complicated system. In high school, you'll take an economics class where you'll spend basically an entire semester learning what I just tried to teach you in about 27 minutes. So it's a lot there, but just don't get too hung up on a lot of the details I'll talk about. Just kind of understand the basic system. Free enterprise, it's the people and businesses who make decisions, not the government. That's the theory of the free enterprise system.